Dear students, welcome to another lecture on research methodology in history. Today we shall be discussing about ancient Indian historiography. Now each society has its own way of recollecting and recording the past. In India, the literary tradition for narrating the past was known as Itihasa, which literally meant thus indeed it was. The term Itihas included most of the literary developments in the post-Vedic era. According to Arthasastra, the Itihasa tradition included Purana, Itivritta, Akhyavika, Udaharana, Dharmasastra and Arthasastra. According to Adipurana, the Itihasa tradition included Itivritta, Aitihya, Amanya, Arsha, Sukta and Dharmasastra. Now, despite this tradition of representing the past, India has been characterized as devoid of any tradition of history writing by the European intelligentsia and the colonial historians. European scholars familiar with the historical writing as a distinct category of literature looked for the same in the Sanskrit articulation of what came to be called Indian civilization, and they were unable to find it. The philologist William Jones suspected that there might be history in the myths and the legends of the Puranas. According to William Jones, the only example of historical writing was the Raj Tarangini, composed by Kalhan in the 12th century AD. Comparison with the Chinese accounts of Sima Qian, the writing in Arabic of Ibn Khaldun, the biblical genealogies and Greco-Roman narratives further strengthened the axiom of Indian society denying history. Arguing for the absence of indigenous history had a practical advantage of allowing for formulation of history for the colonies that would support the colonial policy. Colonial attitude to knowledge pertaining to their colonies had enhanced their control over the colonies. Thus, William Jones wrote of the Itihas Puran being, quote, in our power, unquote. And a century later, Lord Curzon realized the intellectual discovery of the Orient was a necessary tool for the empire. The collection of manuscripts and artifacts for the reconstruction of history became an avid activity. However, the oral compositions of the bards were generally bypassed by the colonial historians. Although scholars such as James Todd and L. P. Tessitore had collected bardic materials and tried to correlate these materials with inscriptions, but bardic materials largely was treated as folk literature and it lacked historicity. Nationalist scholars echoed this colonial perception of Indian society being ahistorical, and hence they called upon their fellow countrymen to write their own history. Representing the past had been crucial for ideological foundation of the nation. The notion of history that the European intelligentsia introduced emanated from the Enlightenment movement. This notion of history was revised in the subsequent period of time, and a broader definition of history and historical tradition was created. And it is in this context that diverse historical traditions of pre-modern civilizations began to be studied. And with this, search for historical consciousness began. Scholars like Sheldon Pollock identified that historical consciousness was embedded in early Indian literary traditions, but it was processed through a special modality and subject to categories, ideas, and constraints to peculiar traditions of India. Scholars like Frazier identified that ancient Indian tradition conceives multiple cosmologies and numerous histories within a massive time scale that defies the idea of any single creation. In such a framework, where divine histories merged with human histories and the histories of the sages merged with those of the kings, history writing was a collaborative endeavor of the community rather than of an individual author. According to historian Parjitar, although historical sense was weak in Vedic literature, it was strong in Puranic literature and in epics. Historian Arvind Sharma suggests that historical sense can be found in epigraphic records, not in the religious texts. Historian like Romila Thapar argues that the core of historical tradition was genealogical records. That is, she finds that genealogical records are very important to know about the past. Historians like Sanjay Subramaniam asserts that real history making can be traced to the period since late 16th century, when early modern consciousness was emerging, particularly in South India, and both the literary and epigraphic records witnessed developed forms of historical composition. There are also scholars who argue that lack of history was probably a positive thing, and they emphasized the plurality and the diversity of ahistorical cultures. Scholars such as Ashish Nandi, Vinay Lal, and so on remarked that the absence of history must not be perceived as a lack, rather as a form of forgetfulness, a disavowal of history as a legitimate form of knowledge. Scholars such as Sheldon Pollock, Perret Trotman are of the opinion that although ancient Indian writers possessed historical consciousness, they did not consider history as an authoritative form of knowledge. They considered the Vedas as the ideal text, and all other texts emulated the Vedas. As a result, history was not simply absent, it was denied in favor of a model of truth that accorded history no epistemological value or social significance. According to historian Trotman, the concept of cyclical time sequence and the location of truth and liberation from samsara in eternity outside time resulted in the formation of an idea of truth that is unaltered and eternal. There is no authoritative transmitter of the truth, no author to text, and the past was beyond memory. Within this framework, the notion of finite historical timing or human agency becomes greatly illogical and inferior form of knowledge. Now we shall be discussing about the various forms of representing the past in ancient India. According to historian Romila Thapar, historical consciousness was present in embedded form in the Vedic corpus of Dan Stuti, that is eulogy of gift giving, Gatha, that is celebration of heroic deeds, Narasami, that is praise of heroes, and Akhyana, that is detailed stories recited during sacrificial rituals. In Danastuti hymns, human heroes were eulogized for their heroism and for making gifts to the composer of the hymns. Thus, the heroes became part of the remembered tradition about the past. The hymns suggest it was a society of clans organized into chiefdoms. The clan was a kin-based unit of agro-pastoralists, administered by a chief who was selected by the clan. The hymns of the Rig Veda, in various incidental ways, recorded relations of friendship or hostility between clans. To take for example, a serious confrontation occurred between the Raja Sudas defending himself against a confederacy of 10 other clans. Of these 10 other clans, some such as the Jodhus and Purus featured in later epics. Rituals such as Abhishek, Rajsuyo and Ashwamedh and Bajpeyo were performed by the Rajas to announce consecration, claims to conquest and sovereignty. Rituals are described in the texts subsequent to the Rig Veda. This was the starting point of what was to become the Prashastis or the eulogies. The composers of this eulogy or Prashastis were the poets or kavis who could also be bards, that is sutas, or ritual specialists, that is the Brahmans. The elaborate narratives or akhyanas became the prototype of the narratives woven into the epic. These texts concerned with the past asserted differential truth claims ranging from what was imagined to what really happened. According to historian Romila Thapar, the embedded tradition becomes somewhat more visible in the epics. Now we shall take example of the two epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. The Mahabharata is an epic of clan polities. The patrons were the Rajas, especially the Kuru Panchala clans, who were mentioned in the earlier Vedic texts as well, and they were asserting their authority as major chiefdoms. It has been argued that a particular category of Brahmans, the Bhrigus, altered the story in parts by adding the didactic sections and thus converted a relatively secular epic into a sacred literature, which took the form of Vaishnava Bhagavatism. Such Bhriguization, as it has been called, gave an identity to the protagonists and their historical contexts. Rewriting the past or incorporating interpolations reflects the various moments seen as historically significant. There was also an attempt to record the history of the chiefdom through claims to kinship, territory, and raids. It emphasized a new feature linked to the status, that is, genealogies. The battle at Kurukshetra was a conflict over succession within the larger Puru lineage. But in effect, it also marked the final decline of the Kshatriya as lineage groups representing clan polities. It becomes a statement on the decline of the chiefdom as a political system. Now, there was nostalgia for a past society that was largely disbanded after the war. The epic makes an attempt to construct fragments of that society, whether remembered or partially fictional, to record the clans and their rajas and to map the significant settlements. In the Ramayana, the conflict was between two types of polities, the kingdom versus the chiefdom, in which the kingdom emerged victorious. As a political document, the Ramayana marks the arrival of the state as a kingdom, of which the epic is a validation. Societies of forest dwellers and chiefdoms were now demonized as Rakshas. Kings came to be seen as incarnation of the deity. This implies appropriation of a symbol for a new order and is opposed to other religious sects such as the Jainas, who were primarily not the worshipper of Vishnu. The Buddhist version of the story of Ram differs from the Valmiki Ramayana. In the Jain version of the Ramayana, that is Paumacharyam of Vimalasuri, there is an insistence on the historicity of the Jain version. The other versions are described as incorrect. That is, the Jain version claims that the other versions are incorrect. Now the central events are broadly similar, but the depiction of Ravan and Rakshas as demon is negated. Instead of being depicted as demons, the people of the forest are identified with well-known lineages and clans such as Vidyadharas, Meghavahanas and the Chedis, who were in turn part of the Jodu or the Jadava descent group. The version of the story presented by Valmiki was questioned in the Jain version, and the question was not about the historicity of the story but more about demonizing and downgrading of the clan societies. According to historian Romila Thapar, historical consciousness as expressed in the different Vedic texts and epics was in part redesigned into what gradually became a historical tradition as available in the Puranas. A characteristics of the Purana from the perspective of history is that it claims greater authenticity for Itihas and is a statement about the past, and this statement has a function in later historical tradition. The Puranas as a genre of text were composed over the first millennium AD and bears the influence of several traditions such as the alternate allusion to Bardic tradition and Brahminical tradition, transition from oral Prakrit to literary Sanskrit and so on. Some of the Puranas had a section on the succession of lineages and of dynasties, that is the Vamsanucharita section, which is of importance to the historical tradition. Puranas provide important information on social values, the rites and rituals such as world conquest, that is Digvijay, or horse sacrifice, that is Ashvamedh, and practice of choosing of an eligible marriage partner by a girl from an assembly of members of the ruling groups, that is Swayambara, associated with the early societies, that is these practices were associated with the early societies. One of the most important development was clearing of lands and extending settlement in the Ganga valley. The related developments were the transition from lineages to states, the crystallization of class and status group, growing distance between those who controlled resources and ordinary people, and the emergence of monarchies. Puranas helped broaden the ideological base of the dominant class by reaching out to various regions and spreading the dominant Brahmanical values throughout the subcontinent. According to historian Upinder Singh, Puranas are extremely useful for the study of historical geography and the emergence of religious cults based on devotion. The stories of interaction or encounter among the demons, gods, and sages represent the interaction between people of different cultures. Now we shall be looking at the Buddhist and the Jain traditions of history writing. The Buddhist and the Jain traditions were grounded in historical context because they were associated with historical persons and events. The literary tradition of both these sects started with the death of Buddha and Mahavira. Texts created in this tradition helped to institutionalize these religions, construction of monasteries, acquisition of considerable amount of landed properties, and the need to decide about their control required for the creation and preservation of documents. In the Buddhist tradition, we find historical orientation in texts such as Jatakas, Tripitaka, Mahavamsa and Deepvamsa. The Deepvamsa and Mahavamsa are basically the histories of the island of Sri Lanka, along with the establishment of the Buddhist Sangha. Jain canonical texts such as Thananga, Vyakkha Pragyapati narrated episodes from the life of Jina, mentioned 24 Jinas, and about the 12 world emperors of the present cycle in India. These texts represent historical consciousness which was different from the Sanskritic tradition. This difference arose from the historicity of the founders, their distance from the Brahminical orthodoxy, and the difference in social background of the patrons of these sects and the urban and literate milieu of the early teachings. Now we shall be looking at the epigraphs. Epigraphs have generally been considered as the most reliable source of information, as they often are contemporary to the period one is studying. Epigraphs are firmly datable documents. They provide information on the eras and the regnal years, and even it is very interesting that even the undated epigraphs can be paleographically assigned to a period. Besides, their provenance help us to demarcate the area under the control of their issuing authority. They could be written on stones, copper plates, coins, and so on. The largest number of epigraphs have been found in South India. Since Harappan scripts have not been deciphered, the earliest datable script written material in India can be dated from the period 3rd century BCE. Since dates and names of the rulers feature prominently in these epigraphic findings, the primary focus of the historians had been exploring political and dynastic history. Since 1960, however, the focus shifted to socio-economic conditions over the dynastic history. It was D.C. Sarkar who systematically generated epigraphic data on socio-economic and cultural history. The earliest available inscription date from the Mauryan period, that is circa 268 to 239 BCE, which tells us about the deeds of the emperor and his commands to the people. Historian Dev Kumar Jhaj has observed that epigraphic records found from Bengal dated to the Gupta era are quite unique in its character. They throw considerable light, these epigraphic records that have been found in Bengal throw considerable light on the regional and local level administrative tiers and officers of the state. These charters record revenue-free grants of land instead of religious donation, which was very common. But the majority of the land grants record from Bengal during the period 400 to 600 CE are actually sale deeds or sale cum gift deeds, the likes of which are not encountered anywhere in the subcontinent. What does this signify? That land was a sellable commodity, which is evident in these records from Bengal. These inscriptions throw invaluable light on the types of land, price of land, and land measurement system. Now we shall be talking about the Charitas, which was also another very important source of information. Charitas are important source on the lives and the activities of great men. Harsha Charita, for example, Harsha Charita by Banbhatta is a great composition of this genre. It describes the lives and the activities of King Harsha of the Pushyabhuti dynasty. Charitas focus on the personality of a king, his court, his territory, his martial, political, administrative achievements, and so on. Their main purpose was eulogizing the king and provide justification for his rule. The king's lineage and his family becomes secondary in the narrative. A brief account of the composer was also provided to establish the credibility of the composer. The tradition differed from the early Bardic or Brahminical tradition. The Charitas were composed according to the rules laid down by the treatise on Indian drama, They were written in ornate Sanskrit and contained well-defined beginnings, middles, and ends. The earlier broader themes of historical narratives were narrowed down to an accounts of events culminating in the achievement of royal glory by the king. The sequence of action was set in chronological order but not in terms of dates and years. Another important aspect of this discussion is the genealogies. We shall be looking at the genealogies now. Genealogies, particularly describing the royal families, have been one of the most important mode of representation of the past. They generally followed the genre of Puranas, but unlike the Puranas, they focus on the ruling family, not on the entire lineage. The legitimation of a particular ruling family was the main purpose of the composition. The influence of Buddhist and Jain tradition can also be found. They are composed both in Sanskrit and other languages. The writers of the Vamsavalis used Puranas, inscriptional records, and their own contemporary oral traditions as their sources. Most new Indian states in the early 2nd millennium CE employed this literary historical form to record the details of their ruling dynasties and respective regions. For example, the Gopal Raja Vamsavali of Nepal is an important account which focused on the kings from the late 11th century to 14th century. It is partly written in Sanskrit and partly in Old Newari. The only text which is considered to have confirmed the idea of history in the modern sense of the term is Kalhan's Rajtarangini. Kalhan stressed on the objectivity of knowledge of past, that sources needed to be examined critically. He offered critical commentary on earlier historians of Kashmir for their pedantic style and lack of truthfulness. However, he did not see any contradiction between a poet, a chronicler, a historian, and considered his work primarily to be a poem or kavya. He believed that karma, dharma, and fate were determinants of historical process. However, he also acknowledges the role of human agency in historical process. His purpose for writing this account was to tell a connected story over a long period of time, to correct the errors of the earlier historians of Kashmir. According to historian Ronald Inden, the text Rajtarangini belong to the Puranic traditions, serving dual functions. It is a historical text or Itihasa, and it is instructional text or Shastra. With this, we come to the conclusion of our discussion. So what we have discussed so far is we have tried to give an analysis of the earlier literature, of the earlier historical traditions that includes the Vedic corpus, which is Puranas, Itivritta, Akhyavika, Udaharana, Dharmasastra, Arthasastra, Aitihya, Amanya, Arsha, Sukta, as well as inscriptional records, genealogical records, charitas, and so on. All these things reveal how ancient Indian writers made sense of the past. The different literary traditions suggests that there was a pluralistic tradition of history writing which for decades has been misrecognized as anything but history. Now, scholars have shown that it is not so important to categorize a society as whether it was ahistorical or historical. What is important is how each society see their past. Not all societies see their past in the same way. So, how they see their past also shows us the nature of this society in the early period of time. Thank you.